Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our first conversation of note for 2008-2009. I'm Ken Meltzer, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's program annotator and insider, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be the host of these conversations of note, and doubly honored that I'm joined this evening by our beloved music director, Robert Spano, to talk about, first of all, a brief overview of 08-09, talk about some of the things that have happened already, and then to focus on a series of concerts that begins this week, our Made in America concerts, and Robert and I will talk more about the premise and the setup for those various concerts. And that's pretty much the outline for the evening, except, of course, for the questions and answers that we'll take from you. And we thank you so much for supporting these talks and for being with us this evening, and, of course, most importantly, your support of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. The reason you're here is that you are among our most esteemed and valued patrons, so we thank you for your support each and every time, and thank you for helping us to kick off our conversation of note this evening. Robert, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's talk, first of all, about a couple of the large themes for 2008-2009. We began with two concerts that you called the 3 Bs, and perhaps we can talk just a little bit about them to begin with.
They're not so original, I suppose. But we got fascinated with the idea of hearing Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms together in a single evening, because despite the fact that we often define classical music as Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, or at least colloquially and stereotypically that's what we do, is Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, we seldom hear the three composers side by side in a single evening. And I found the experience fascinating in how they are the same and how they are different, because I found both facets to be equally interesting and fascinating. The whole idea of approaching old music fresh was also something that interested me. There is, in our programming in general, a balancing act we try to achieve, which is multifaceted. And certainly one of those components is the great staple of symphonic repertoire, 300 years of German music. And that is a kind of core mission of ours, in the sense that we are a museum. That's okay. Not in a concert, though. And the much of the American originals we'll be talking about later have to do with another mission of ours, which is not as a museum, but rather as a gallery, where our exhibit is always changing. So that the core mission of the museum to preserve this tradition is really important to us. It's interesting that the root of the word tradition is also the root of the word traitor. And as Toscanini used to say, tradition is the last bad performance. So there is something about approaching the old, or approaching our tradition, that requires an infusion of new life and new perspective and fresh understanding all the time. And I was realizing, as we started rehearsing this music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, that the culture, the musical culture that we live in as an orchestra, involves so much new music and unusual repertoire in the mix of the very familiar and usual repertoire, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that when we come to this older music, we bring a perspective that's informed and revitalized by our experience with the less familiar and the new, which is just a fantastic place from which to approach this repertoire. Rather than thinking we know it, we discover it anew. And it's a wonderful experience for us, and we felt the audience with us in that enterprise those 2 weeks. It's interesting to realize that we talk about pieces of music, but in fact they're not objects. They're potentials, they're possibilities, they're maps to a terrain that we then need to travel. And despite the fact that we think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony as a thing, it's not. Even if we have a CD to hold in our hand. Does the CD really contain Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? And even with a CD, our experience of it is different every time we hear it. So all the more different is the experience of a piece when we approach it again as performers or in a live performance setting, how different an experience of the same piece, something we know and love, can be, and how much more there is always to learn and discern and explore and discover. The Beethoven Fifth and the Brahms First were the two big symphonies in those 2 weeks, and I can't think of anything more iconic than those two pieces. And somehow they were as new as if they were written yesterday in our experience of them, because we were really digging around inside of them in ways we were getting fresh perspective and new understanding. So that was really a very rewarding beginning of the season. No less rewarding because Manny Axe was here and Peter Serkin was here. Manny was playing the Beethoven Third Piano Concerto, and Peter played the Brahms First Piano Concerto. And then we explored two different ways of approaching Bach. The first week we did the Stokowski transcription of the Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor for organ, and the second week we did the Webern orchestration of the Ritcherchar from the six-voice Ritcherchar from the musical offering. It's interesting with Bach that his music is conceived independently of its instrumental manifestation. In other words, the music has an abstract or platonic form that then can take shape on an organ or with an orchestra or with a violin and a harpsichord. And it's a very different way of approaching the making of music than, say, Debussy, where it's very hard to hear the beginning of the Afternoon of a Faun on anything but a flute, because the music is conceived so closely allied with its vehicle. It never sounds quite the same without a flute, you know? It's not as good. It's still beautiful. And Bach somehow transcends this, and it was in the way he thought, because he was constantly transcribing his own music. The famous violin partita, E major violin partita, he transcribed for orchestra and used as a sinfonia in a cantata, the introduction to a cantata. So and there are countless other examples of his exploration of his own music in other manifestations. So it was very fascinating to take that spirit and approach these two different ways very different ways of looking at his music. One was the Stokowski, where he somehow, in his genius, manages to make the orchestra sound like an organ. It's the most uncanny experience. I remember after the first rehearsal, many of the musicians and I were walking off stage saying, how does he do that? Because we really felt the cathedral setting of what we were doing. And contrasted with Webern's very detailed, finely etched, refined attention to minutiae and delicate scoring of the Ritcherchar from the musical offering. The Ritcherchar from the musical offering is a very special piece in Bach's output because, well, in the first place, it's a six-voice fugue, which is unheard of. It's simply not done. There are a few, but very few. And the issue is that fugues are hard enough to conceive and enact with 3 voices or 4 voices, let alone 5, and certainly not 6. It comes about, the musical offering is so titled, because Bach was visiting the court of Frederick the Great, where his son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, was the court composer. And for Bach to make that visit was a noted event, largely because Bach was not such an important composer in his own lifetime. His obituary said that he was a very good organist. And a lot of his music lay dormant for 100 years after his death. And part of the reason for this strange fact of a composer that we now think of as one of the greatest, The Baker's Biographical Dictionary of Music and Musicians begins its entry for J.S. Bach with the supreme arbiter and lawgiver in music, comparable to Aristotle in philosophy and Da Vinci in art. And we didn't listen to him for 100 years. Part of the issue there was that he was out of step with the times. He simply wasn't fashionable. He was continuing to write highly complex contrapuntal music, and this was a style that was changing in his lifetime, and his sons were very much part of this new wave of music in Germany at that time, the Empfindsamkeit, the new simplicity. They were interested in melodies with harmonies. They were interested in music that would make for good digestion after dinner. They were looking for something lighter, more immediate in its appeal. And Carl Philipp Emanuel was certainly one of those composers, and Frederick the Great was very aligned with this aesthetic himself. So Bach pays this visit, representing, in a sense, an old world view, which was very devout, because another facet of Bach's adherence to this style was that it was a reflection of divine order, and he almost always ended his scores with Solo Dei Gloria, to God alone the glory. So his musical mission was also theological, and this was antithetical to his son and to Frederick the Great. But he had a reputation as a great improviser. He could sit down and, on the spot, generate music of extraordinary beauty. So when he arrives, Frederick the Great plays him a subject on which he says, "Play me a fugue." And the interesting thing about the subject is that it defies contrapuntal treatment. For one thing, it's very long, and it's also very complicated, very chromatic. A good Bach subject would be something like this. Shorter, simpler, more direct, ready for treatment. This is so long-winded and complicated that it defies this treatment, but he did it. He sat down and played a three-voice fugue on the spot, and Frederick the Great had the audacity to say, "How about six?" Bach demurred and said, "I'll send you one in the mail," which he then did. He went home and wrote the six-voice fugue, but he also wrote a series of canons. Canons are fugue-related, canon meaning law, and a musical canon is a complicated form of a round. Row, row, row your boat is an example of a canon. You can also do canons, though, where if you think about row, row, row your boat, what if this voice were to begin, then another voice were to come in but do what this voice did backwards, or upside down and backwards, or start at a different level. So this one starts at this pitch, and this one starts at this pitch. So there's all kinds of ways to complicate a canon, complicate the law. And Bach actually sent Frederick the Great a number of what they called puzzle canons, because they weren't solved. What he would do was write out one voice, and you had to figure out how the canon worked. Where does the next voice start? How does it fit in with the first voice? So they're like musical crossword puzzles. And we're pretty sure that Frederick the Great received this rather brilliant missive and tossed it on the shelf and never looked at it, which is very sad. And it's doubtful that Bach ever heard this music realized in his lifetime. He also sent along a trio sonata for flute, violin, and harpsichord just to complete the set. So that is the musical offering. And the six-voice fugue is an extraordinary example of his genius late in his life in response to someone who was rather challenging to his skills. It's likely that his son actually wrote that fugue subject. Frederick the Great was not that accomplished a musician. And Schoenberg in particular believed that Carl Philipp Emanuel had conceived of this subject to annoy his father. They had a very contentious relationship anyway. So those two manifestations of Bach were particularly rewarding for us too. The thing that was interesting for all of us on stage, and I know from many members of the audience who spoke to me, they had gleaned the same thing. At a certain moment, we'd realize, oh, all these pieces, meaning Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms in the single evening, had a fugue. Or all these pieces had certain kinds of harmonic similarities. For example, in the Beethoven Piano Concerto, C minor Piano Concerto, he chooses to do the second movement in an unusual key, very remote from C minor, which is E major. But Brahms, in fact, in the First Symphony does the same thing, because the second movement is... So it's an interesting thing, the commonalities we found, but also the differences. Beethoven somehow sounds much leaner and cleaner and meaner than Brahms, who tends to sound thick and rich and chocolatey. And Bach always remains somehow completely baffling in terms of how such complexity can sound so simple and natural. Webern actually said about aesthetics that it was his belief that the closer we approach a true and perfect work of art, the closer we feel like we're approaching a work of nature. And I always feel that way with Bach, too. So those were a fun couple weeks for us, and I hope if you were able to attend any of that they were as rewarding for you as they were for us. It was a treat to start the year that way. We actually started the year also with a week of what we call boot camp. We do what very few orchestras do. We spent a week rehearsing. We had 6 rehearsals with no concerts. So we were rehearsing things, for example, we did sectional rehearsals on the Brahms. Just the strings were working alone, just the winds. And it's an amazing way to work because this is how many times have we played Brahms first, and now we're rehearsing it like we don't know it. And of course we do know it. And it means you're really listening to detail and refinement and really working on our own skill, honing our own skill. And that's the particularly rewarding week that we spend every year at the beginning.
And that's a kind of experience a lot of American orchestras either don't do or just don't have the time to do. It's much more common, for example, in Russia, for the orchestras to have sectional rehearsal after sectional rehearsal, and it shows up a lot of times in the quality and the unanimity of their playing. And I wonder if you felt that those sectional rehearsals were of benefit.
Invaluable to us. Yeah. Very special.
Do you supervise the sectional rehearsals?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Parenthetically, we should probably mention that the Bach and Webern, or the Bach, Stokowski, and Bach-Webern pieces that you mentioned, you talked about the neglect of Bach's music for a great period of time, and to a great degree, certainly the Stokowski and to some degree the Webern, those transcriptions were products of those composers' desire to see Bach's music have a greater place in the concert hall when it didn't back in the middle part of the 20th century. Things have changed, but necessity was the mother of invention for 2 magnificent orchestral transcriptions. And talking about the sectional rehearsals, I was thinking about that in terms of the Bach-Webern, because the arrangement is, first of all, so delicate and so exposed, and what I find remarkable about it is usually when there's a transcription of a Bach piece or Bach fugue, one instrument or one group of instruments plays the entire fugue melody. But in the Webern, you may have the trumpet play 2 notes and the horn play 2, all of this one melody, but 2 notes from the trumpet, 2 notes from the horn or whatever. It must be a remarkably challenging piece for a conductor and orchestra to have that all of those voices just flow seamlessly.
It's the kind of thing you can't practice alone, because if in the context of 12 notes you get 2 of them, the only way you know what to do with them in a way that makes sense is if you're hearing what everybody's doing around you. So it's a piece that really needs to be rehearsed and not practiced.
My goodness. Well, we should probably dive into our Made in America or American Originals, because we have 4 concerts to talk about during our time together this evening. And first of all, let's talk about the concept of these American Originals concerts. What are we presenting to our audiences?
Well, I think given our commitment over the last 8 years to living American composers, we were fascinated to realize what a strong link there is to European tradition in American music. The core of American musical tradition is really no different than the core of European musical tradition. Now, of course, what happened in America musically is what happened in America socially, and we have global influences that have made American music quite distinct. The fact of jazz was the globe took notice, but it's really an American phenomenon because of the influences that created such a language here. But the beginning of symphonic culture in America is certainly European. And if you look at the histories and growth of American orchestras, they often are predominantly German or French or Russian. They have their histories that are peculiar to them in terms of who immigrated and who took the trouble to really generate them. We were also fascinated with later waves of immigration that affected the American musical scene, like the fact that Schoenberg and Stravinsky lived down the street from each other in L.A. They hated each other. But Stravinsky actually waited till Schoenberg died to write any 12-tone music. He did do it once Schoenberg was dead, but he wouldn't concede that it was interesting until he had him out of the way. But there they were in L.A., down the street from each other. So it's already that's already a fascinating thing about American musical culture. And then to realize that Dvorak took a tremendous interest in American music, as we know from his New World Symphony, and he had lots of ideas about what we should be doing culturally, musically in America. Tchaikovsky was performing at Carnegie Hall. Rachmaninoff was conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra and performing all over the country. The Monroe Doctrine was not in effect, and there was a tremendous amount of fertilization, cross-fertilization of many musical traditions that we now enjoy even more fully. And we wanted to explore that a bit in the sense of having an American music festival that included Dvorak, Bartók, and Rachmaninoff, as well as Samuel Barber and Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, who are more iconically American. And in fact, all the music that we're playing in the American Music Festival was written in America, or at least conceived in the case of the New World Symphony, so that I think it points to the richness of our heritage, our musical heritage, in a way that isn't always so apparent. And we're also very honored to have Leonard Slatkin be here to do one of those 4 concerts, as he is very much one of the deans of American conductors at this point. And then to top off the festival with Dr. Atomic of John Adams, which is one of the most important operas of the 21st century, I think we can fairly say, even though we're not very far along in that century. It's a very, very special work that I'm very glad we're able to do here. So that's the shape of the festival, and that was the idea behind it, was to explore American music from that perspective. What's the first one? It's Leonard's, isn't it?
It is this week, and Leonard Slatkin's conducting, and we open with Leonard Bernstein's Jeremiah Symphony, with Kelly O'Connor as the soloist in the 3rd movement. And that's a work that took place at an interesting time in Bernstein's life, because about the year after he had completed the composition, he was waking up with a big hangover after having had a concert and a party the night before, and got a call from the general manager of the New York Philharmonic, who said, well, you're going to have to conduct the concert this afternoon because Bruno Walter, who was supposed to conduct it, is sick and he can't do it. And by the way, it's a nationally broadcast concert at Carnegie Hall, and good luck. And Bernstein went over, talked to Walter, and went out and made his debut, and it was a great breakthrough for Bernstein, and it ended up getting him a number of appearances around the country, including at the orchestra where his teacher, Fritz Reiner, who taught at the Curtis Institute, was music director, and he invited Bernstein to come and make his conducting debut. Bernstein conducted the Firebird and also his world premiere of his Jeremiah Symphony, which he dedicated to his father. He had written it the year before, but probably would have had a hard time getting a performance had it not been for what happened in New York. So that's the opening piece. And then we have the Samuel Barber Piano Concerto with your friend Garrick Olson. And then a piece, of course, that you love and conduct quite often, the Symphonic Dances of Sergei Rachmaninoff.
I'm so glad you point out how early in his career the Jeremiah happens, because I think during his lifetime we tended, on the whole, to regard Bernstein as more of a conductor than a composer. He always felt that his most important work was as a composer and not as a conductor. Although he took his conducting very seriously, he felt that his compositional work was very important. And I think that that is beginning to change. The perception of him is beginning to change since his death, as so often unfortunately happens. Once a composer's dead, he's better. And one of the things I admire so much about his music was his commitment and determination to follow his own muse, to obey his own voice in a climate where he wasn't taken so seriously because he wasn't doing what was accepted in compositional circles at the time. The phenomenon that we experienced pretty much from the 50s through the 70s in American music in terms of the teaching and performing of new composition was a kind of hegemony of an aesthetic which was serial music or 12-tone music, with an alternative being chance music. So we basically had Milton Babbitt and John Cage as iconic symbols of those aesthetics that were sort of the status quo of new composition. And Bernstein was doing nothing of the kind. Bernstein was pursuing an aesthetic where tonality was still very much a tool for him to structure his music. It was an organizing principle. Melody was supreme as another facet of the music. I know we often say that music without melody isn't appealing to us. In fact, I think that is often true. There is, however, a lot of music that isn't terribly melodic that is very appealing to us, and I think it's a bit of a misleading thing if we think melody is exactly the reason why we gravitate to something or not. It's interesting. Beethoven is a very bad tunesmith, like the Eroica. It's really not that interesting. What makes Beethoven so admirable and great is his ability to take this material that seems rather prosaic and do things with it that are unexpected, unheard of, unimaginable. And that's a very different gift than, say, Tchaikovsky's gift to write, which is a great tune. So it's an interesting thing, the role melody can play or not play in the construction of a piece. But for Bernstein, melody was an extremely important component of what he was trying to accomplish musically. So he doggedly stuck to this vision, for lack of a better word, because it was an oral vision, that he wanted to hear this music, and he stuck to it, often to the point where he wasn't taken seriously. So because he wrote West Side Story, we can't take him seriously as a composer because it's just the greatest American opera ever written. Unfortunately, it was on Broadway, and I think a lot of those distinctions that we made for so long are breaking down as more and more composers are blurring those distinctions in their own music. Certainly, the composers we have been living with as the Atlanta School of Composers, Jennifer Higdon, Chris Theophanides, Michael Gandolfi, and Osvaldo Golijov, they all have a tremendous interest in popular music, world music, and they blur the lines between what is high art or concert music and what is not highbrow music. And that's actually the way it was when highbrow music was being written. Haydn was constantly using all kinds of folk material. Mozart was trying to imitate Turkish bands. They were as engaged with the music of the street as these composers who are writing now are with the music of our streets. And it's a strange thing that happened where we decided that if you did that, it just wasn't, it's almost as if it's enjoyable, it can't be good. It's a dangerous way of thinking. It's kind of like that strange phenomenon that you're not allowed to clap between movements. It's a historically inaccurate admonition. A Mozart symphony was often presented playing the first movement at the beginning of the concert, then a couple concert arias, a piano concerto, maybe a serenade, a couple more movements of the symphony, another set of arias, and then the last movement of the symphony. So there was no sense of this heilige Kunst about the work. And I hope and believe that we're beginning to understand that entertainment is also a beautiful word. It comes from entretenir, which means to hold between, to have between us. So there's something wonderful about the word entertainment in that we share an experience of something of beauty and enlivening quality. So it's, I think, a testament to Bernstein's greatness that when he received a lot of grief for his path in this direction, he did it anyway. And I think now his standing as a composer is increasing rather than waning.
You mentioned Bernstein and his relationship, his aesthetic relationship to people of the Atlanta School, and I can't help but thinking about the Jeremiah Symphony with its incorporation of jazz and Hebrew liturgical music to your friend Osvaldo Golihov.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. And Barber, similarly, was similar to Bernstein, was pursuing a path of some resistance in his own lifetime that now we're very glad he did. He was commissioned for his first symphony by a gentleman that he believed would have very, very conservative tastes, and so he was trying not to get too carried away. And in fact, the gentleman who had commissioned him liked avant-garde, edgy music, and so he was very disappointed in the first symphony. But in fact, I think Barber's capacity to engage a very traditional language of music and do it in a way that's very fresh and very distinct and unique to him. He has his own voice without using wildly different materials from his predecessors is a great gift of his.
And in this case, one of two Barber pieces will be featuring during the American Originals 4 concerts, the piano concerto with Garrick Olson playing, a piece that Samuel Barber wrote for John Browning, a great American virtuoso, and as you said, a piece very much like the Bernstein, very melodic, but very contemporary at the same time and very individual in terms of Barber's voice. And then certainly another composer who valued melody and rich orchestral sonorities, Sergei Rachmaninoff and his symphonic dances, his last orchestral work, composed while he was in the United States. Actually, he was in Long Island at the time when he composed the work.
It's a remarkable work, I find, in his output, very similar to the Third Symphony, because he was evolving. Rachmaninoff is another composer very much in line with Bernstein and Barber in his going his own way, bucking the trend. But as he developed, he got more and more lean and classical, an almost neoclassical approach, and starker and sometimes more aggressive language than he did, say, in the Second Piano Concerto. And I was thinking of that. I was coming down from Ellijay this afternoon and thinking of the opening of the symphonic dances, because it has quite an arresting beginning. After a short introduction, these chords are quite nothing romantic there per se, and it's a wonderful development in his music. I think the other thing I am equally fascinated by in the symphonic dances is his use of the DAC array. This chant from the Middle Ages haunted his music and his mind and his imagination all his life. It's the same chant that Berlioz uses in the Symphonie Fantastique in the Dream of the Witch's Sabbath, when the bells start striking, and it is the DAC array from the Mass, so it's the Day of Judgment, the Day of Wrath, and it was Rachmaninoff was a very depressive person. His first symphony was such a disaster. Wasn't it Glazunov conducting drunk? It was Glazunov.
Yes, it was. Yes, and the drunk part too.
The conductor was drunk, the performance was terrible, and the piece was very badly received. He was very young, and it devastated him so deeply he stopped writing music. He finally went to a hypnotist, and thanks to that therapy, he wrote the Second Piano Concerto, which was his escape from his own writer's block. And what a magnificent re-entry into his own creativity. He nevertheless remained quite a depressive personality, and this particular motive haunted him, no doubt partially because of its morbidity, but also because of its musical beauty and usefulness, because again, here's a piece of rather simple material that can be treated and developed in a number of ways, very much like Beethoven. And it does permeate a great deal of his music, and in the symphonic dances it's especially present and especially elaborated, varied, and spiced up. It's really quite a magnificent display of imagination, his ability to take this simple motive and use it to such tremendous effect.
There's even a little hint of the First Symphony that sneaks its way into the opening movement. So he didn't necessarily intend it to be his last piece, although he called it perhaps his last spark, but there does seem to be a little bit of a valedictory quality in terms of quoting past pieces, and of course that reliance on that leitmotif throughout his compositional life, the DAC array. Mm-hmm. So that's our opening weekend with Leonard Slatkin conducting and Garrick Olson and Kelly O'Connor as our soloists, and then you conduct your first.
Kelly, for those of you who heard Ainada Mar, Kelly was singing the role of Lorca with Dawn in Ainada Mar of Goliath, and we're very happy to have her back to do this. She's returning the following season, which we're pretty much done planning at this point as well, so it'll be great to continue to hear her artistry.
And that brings us to week 2 of this mini-festival, and the first that you'll be conducting of the 4, and Copland's Appalachian Spring, the Barber Violin Concerto with Joshua Bell, and Bela Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra.
I can't think of anyone who defined globally American music more than Aaron Copland. And it's just stunning how he did that. It's almost incomprehensible, but he managed somehow to find a way of organizing his musical materials that we hear our own geography in the same way that Sibelius captures the expanse of the north and the forests and the lakes, and that somehow I feel I'm in Paris when I listen to Ravel, even when he's doing Spanish music. So it's really quite something, and it's not easy to put one's finger on it. I think there are certain things one can point to, which is a kind of purity of the intervallic structure of things, like the is very bare, simple intervals, the fanfare. And similarly, at the beginning of Appalachian Spring, there's a tremendous simplicity of melodic material. It's a remarkable feat to convey Appalachia in such an immediate way. It has this, yes. And maybe the more obvious example of his ability to simplify is his use of the shaker melody, which is "It's a Gift to Be Simple," which he uses later in the work, of course. So we couldn't possibly have American music without Aaron Copland being there. The Barber Violin Concerto is perhaps one of his most loved works, and Josh is one of the great interpreters of the Violin Concerto. Maybe one of the most memorable moments in the Violin Concerto is the second movement, which has this very distinctively and it's identifiably Sam Barber's language to have this kind of melodic writing, which starts as an oboe solo in the second movement. That's a, I think, great example of his tremendous melodic gift, no less so than Tchaikovsky or Mozart or so many others.
He had an interesting background. He was, one of his aunts, I believe, was Louise Homer, who was a very famous contralto, and he himself was a very accomplished baritone who studied at Curtis and made some lovely recordings. His singing voice was really quite exceptional, and lyricism was, I think, just a part of his being, and as you played so beautifully there, it's certainly very much a part of his compositions. The mid-40s, for all the turmoil, was quite a remarkable time to be in New York City. That's where Bernstein made his conducting debut with the New York Philharmonic in 1943, and around that same time, Bela Bartok was trying to survive in New York after having escaped the Nazis in Hungary with his wife, not faring particularly well because of the economic situation, because of his ill health. And Serge Koussevitzky, at the behest of Fritz Reiner, and Joseph Szigeti went to visit Bartok in his hotel, or hospital room, I should say, and said, "I have a commission for you to write a new orchestral work. Here's $500 and $500 more when you complete it." And the result was the Concerto for Orchestra.
For $500. Bartok was a path breaker in 20th century music in so many ways, but perhaps one of the most salient is his research of folk music. He was as great an ethnomusicologist as he was a composer, and he was always doing field work. He'd go out and listen to folk music in its native environment and transcribe it and tape it and study it, and he would make transcriptions of the folk tunes that he heard sometimes, But what's even more remarkable, I think, is that it became infused in his musical language, and he wrote, in a sense, his own folk tunes, heavily influenced by the music he had studied as an ethnomusicologist. So his music has a tremendous blend of this earthy peasant folk music, which in his environment, as he was studying it in Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria as he traveled, often had extremely interesting, complex rhythms and also some very interesting scale patterns that were not at all similar to the major minor scales that were happening in European music otherwise. It's actually a very fertile musical world that he was exploring, and it heavily influenced his language. The Concerto for Orchestra is, I think, a particularly remarkable piece from him in that as he was writing music in New York, he was getting more and more simple in a way. I don't mean to say that it's simple music, but his language was getting a greater clarity and immediacy and not as dense or thick or busy or complex. And it's a wonderfully immediate piece in that way, very clear in its message, and also a wonderful showpiece for the orchestra. It is very much a concerto in the sense of virtuoso showpiece for every section of the orchestra.
Obviously, Bartók knew he was writing it for the Boston Symphony, which was and is one of the great orchestras in the country, and it's a remarkable challenge, and it's a testament to any orchestra when they can play it and play it successfully.
It's also amazing to me that works like the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra or The Rite of Spring that were once considered exceedingly difficult and take tremendous amounts of rehearsal time have now been around somehow long enough that the musicians know it in such a way that we rehearse it like Mozart or Beethoven. It's not that it's become easy, but somehow we understand the language so differently and better over time. Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto was decreed unplayable, but every student studies it now. Yes, please. I don't know. Do you know, Ken?
It actually was. It premiered in Boston with Koussevitzky conducting, and to great acclaim there. And then within a month or two, came to New York with Koussevitzky and Boston Symphony. And Bartók was brought onto the stage in both places many times to receive the cheers. It also got great reviews. So it actually was a piece that was, I guess, accepted as a bad word, but enjoyed and appreciated.
That's very
by
strange.
Early audiences. Yeah.
Very unusual for great music to get that kind of recognition, and not only new music, because I have a wonderful book that is a lexicon of musical invective, and there are great reviews of first performances of the Beethoven symphonies, Brahms symphonies. It's amazing the things that were said. Brahms' first symphony is a writhing dragon devoid of any sense, musical sense, and so on. I mean, it's really quite remarkable.
Yep. But this one actually did get good reviews and good reception, and really it was a lifesaver in the short term for Bartók, who was deathly ill and died within a year after the premiere, but at least for the brief period it rejuvenated him, both creatively and just in terms of his life in general. And in fact, really, the piece, he says, in his comments on the piece, kind of follows that darkness into light. I mean, there's a lugubrious slow movement in between, but generally from that very dark-hued opening to the brilliance of the end, there's that journey from darkness to light.
Yeah, that dark opening is so typical of Bartók, too, in that it's all piled on fourths, which he was very fond of. The great thing about Koussevitzky was if it had been badly received, he would have repeated it all the more often.
Well, I hate to leave that concert because it's so fun to talk about, but we should get on to Donald Runickel's concert the weekend of November 13.
Donald has Evelyn Glennie playing Corigliano's percussion concerto with him. And Corigliano is another he'd kill me if he heard me say grandfather, but he is 70. And he's another grandfather to this generation of American composers that's getting a lot more attention than he did in terms of what he was doing musically. And I don't know this percussion concerto, and I have no doubt it will be. He's a great concerto writer. The piano concerto, the clarinet concerto, the violin concerto. He understands how to feature a soloist and to get the orchestra to work in a supportive way with that protagonist. And I have no doubt this will be as scintillating a piece as his other concertos.
It's written for Evelyn Glennie, who is one of the most dynamic performers. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to see Evelyn Glennie perform, but she's a Scottish woman, slight, very athletic, also profoundly deaf, but is a remarkable musician and quite a show person on stage. And when pieces are written for her, they are designed not only to show her prowess as an instrumentalist, but also to display her athleticism and the way that she moves about the stage. And the way that John Corigliano has constructed this piece, there are many stations for her. It's for string orchestra and for percussion, and John Corigliano has arranged it so that she will be moving from station to station playing the piece. Each movement begins with a cadenza and then goes into the main part of the concerto, and he calls the piece Conjure because he feels as if the soloist is conjuring up the music that then develops after all. So it promises to be a real showpiece in every way. Speaking of showpieces, the Cuban Overture by George Gershwin opens, and then you talked about Antonin Dvorak and a piece that he was inspired to write when he was the head of a music conservatory on the Lower East Side in New York, his Symphony No. 9 from the New World.
Yeah, I was so glad Donald wanted to do the piece. Not everyone does. It's a piece that gets done so much. There are many people who would shy away from it. I love doing it myself, and I was very glad Donald wanted to do it. It is a piece which strangely sounds more like Dvorak than American music, despite the fact he used a great deal of material that he gathered while he was in America. It ends up being a symphony much more in line with his own set of symphonies than it ends up being an American symphony. But nevertheless, I think a wonderful postcard. It's as if he wrote back to family from the States in Czech.
So that's the weekend of November 13th with Donald Runnicles. And finally, that brings us to the Atlanta premiere of John Adams' opera, Dr. Atomic, which, as you've mentioned, has really become one of the most performed and most important operas of the early part of this century. It's a piece that you conducted with the Lyric Opera of Chicago and are reprising here with essentially the same cast.
I have the same cast.
Same cast as, and to a great degree, the same cast that's performing it at the Metropolitan Opera.
No, there's a number of differences from the Met.
Okay.
The interesting thing about the work is it's had already in its brief life many different incarnations. He's been changing it for, I think the only thing that did not have changes was between Amsterdam and Chicago. The premiere was done in San Francisco by Donald, and then John and Peter Sellers, who wrote the libretto and directed the opera, made extensive changes for the performances in Amsterdam. That version then came to Chicago where I did it. It's now happening at the Met in a very different version than happened in Chicago. There are some different singers. The role of the mezzo is now the role for a coloratura and so on. There's a number of changes that were made with different voice types in mind. And from my understanding, it's not musically so different as it is vocally. The vocal writing is changed rather than the whole musical structure being changed. But we're going back to, I was so enamored of our cast in Chicago that I asked all of them to come to do the performances here. And we're doing the version that took place in Amsterdam and Chicago.
Well, we should talk a little bit about the setup, for want of a better term, of what is being portrayed in Dr. Atomic, and then we can talk a bit about the music, of course, as well.
Yeah, the entire opera takes place the night of the first atomic test at Los Alamos. So it's a meditative look at that historic event. I think it's hard for us to to remember a world where we didn't have nuclear weapons. And it's funny how certain things that are the topic of the day no longer are the topic of the day, but actually nothing's changed, and we could still be talking about it. And Peter said a wonderful thing to the chorus as we began rehearsals with them for Dr. Atomic. He said, opera, the great thing about opera is it's the last place in our high-paced society where things are too long. And he said, this is a good thing, because this is a subject where we want to take not just a second look, but a third look, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, in that experience of contemplating this event in the history of the world. I hear often that with John's operas, say Death of Klinghoffer or Nixon in China or this one, that he's writing from a propagandistic point of view. I know that in his own mind he's not, nor is Peter Sellers putting together the libretto in this way. He's rather asking us to contemplate the reality with which we live and to form the opinions we form from contemplating it. But the facts are really quite indisputable that we are the country that has used nuclear weapons. This was the beginning of that. We continue to have this arsenal. There is a proliferation of these weapons in the globe now in a way that's unprecedented. And it's difficult. And I think they intentionally created a work that is difficult. My mother, who is very conservative in her tastes, I know when I've done Britain operas, she says they're best experienced with a nap. And she came to Chicago to hear this opera, and I had no idea how she was going to react, and she absolutely loved it because she felt that it was this opportunity to really reconsider, to think again, to look again, to contemplate the reality with which she lived. And it actually took her back to memories of her childhood of duck and cover and the realities with which she had lived this reality. But this is the first nuclear test, not Hiroshima. Despite the fact that the end of the opera ends, the last thing we hear is a Japanese woman in Hiroshima. It's a recording of her asking for water. But that is not translated. It's used as a sound material, so if you don't speak Japanese, you don't know she's saying that. Peter insisted that it should not be translated. But nevertheless, that's what she's saying. So the scientists who were working on this project were very conflicted. And in fact, there was a rush to have this nuclear test because Truman was going to meet with Stalin. There was tremendous desire on Truman's part to have this in his arsenal, negotiation arsenal, when he spoke to Stalin, that he had the bomb. And he wanted this project pursued. The scientists there had written quite an impassioned letter to Truman saying that the bomb should not be used without giving the Japanese warning, which he never read. It was deemed too classified for the president to read. So it's a fascinating moment in history, in our history. Of course, the scientists were also enamored and seduced by the scientific fascination of this exploration of energy. They had no idea what was going to happen. I think it was Fermi who actually ended up having the best prediction of the scope and power of the bomb. But the predictions were wildly different as to what would actually happen. It was not an underground test. The effects of the test continue to affect that part of the country in terms of health and the residual effect of that bomb. So it's an important opera. It's a contemplative opera. It's not an enjoyable opera. But my mother loved it. And I do think it invites us to contemplate with the people on stage who the main character that the opera revolves around is Oppenheimer, who was running the project. His wife figures largely in the story. And there are a number of Native American influences in the unfolding of the opera, because in fact the Native Americans were doing a lot of work for the scientists in terms of house cleaning, nannying, janitors. They were doing a lot of the grunt work for the project. And at the same time, they were having their ceremonies according to their traditions, like a corn dance that they invited the scientists to. And the scientists their wives brought potluck to this event. So they were interacting in all kinds of ways. And so there's this strange paradox of the exploitation of nature on the part of the scientists and the reverence for nature on the part of the Native Americans that Peter certainly exploited in the context of the opera. Peter Sellers put together the libretto from primary sources. He did not write it. He culled it. And the great thing about Oppenheimer was he was an avid reader. So Peter was able to use everything from the Bhagavad Gita to Baudelaire in the course of the opera, because that's what Oppenheimer was reading. And so there's beautiful texts in the libretto, as well as beautiful music in the score, and often difficult music. Peter and I had many discussions about how we felt John had found some new level for himself. And speaking of Schoenberg and Stravinsky living in LA, one thing we felt he had done was find a way to make a hybrid of Schoenberg and Stravinsky much of the time, which was absolutely fascinating. The other characters in the opera are the other scientists, as well as the military personnel who were involved, and their agenda, which was timetable. They were not so interested in the science as in the science producing the product, and on time, because of the immediate need of this negotiation. So it's a fascinating work. It's very different in its two acts. The first act ends like any Handel opera with a great aria, and has a kind of unfolding that feels very classical in its operatic approach. The second half of the opera, the second act, is almost in real time, because what happened is the weather was so bad that night that they kept having to delay the test and delay the test. And so there was this tremendous angst of waiting. And Peter described it very well once in a rehearsal too, where he said there's that part of waiting at the beginning where you're waiting with tremendous energy. And then there's that part of waiting where you've really had enough, but you're still waiting, but it's depleting. And John took on the challenge of trying to affect that experience in his score, which is very dangerous, to write boring music. And what's wonderful is he found a way to do it that doesn't let us off the hook. So there's points in the second act of the opera where you really want to get on with it, and you can't. But then he'll throw something in that's commentary on that experience, which is welcome relief. There's other arias and interruptions in the course of this agonizing waiting. And John also has this wonderful way of creating musical clocks that are ticking down the time, and often various clocks going at different rates of speed. I was at someone's house recently where every clock had a different time on it. I don't know how they got through the day. But he somehow gets this kind of experience that the clock is ticking, but there are many of them ticking, which has to do with the psychological complexity of this countdown. So that's the overview.
I want to just share with you an excerpt from John Adams' just published memoirs, Hallelujah, Junction. And there's a whole chapter devoted to Dr. Atomic. And this is the last paragraph in the chapter on Dr. Atomic. But Dr. Atomic will never be an easy addition to the standard repertoire. The long, dreamlike second act will always present a challenge for directors and conductors. Where Act 1 follows a more or less logical narrative thread, Act 2 is a nearly 90-minute symphonic arch that oscillates back and forth between a real-time event, the countdown, and a deliberately abstracted treatment of time and space that is part dream vision and part sudden, terrifying apparition. Moody soliloquies and alien electronic moonscapes give way to frantic scrambling, shrieking choral voices, and panicky orchestral stampedes. Sitting one night at a Chicago performance, conducted masterfully by Robert Spano, and with Gerald Finley again singing the role of the great physicist, I wondered how this complicated piece of music drama would fare in the hands of less caring or less informed performers. Some operas will survive a mangled or indifferent production, but others live or die on the devotion and intelligence of the performers. Dr. Atomic, because of its exceptionally risky formal scheme, is more vulnerable than most, and it will always require the most alert and sensitive treatment from conductors, singers, and stage directors if it is to make the impact it made in its earliest embodiment. That's from John Adams' Memoirs, just released this past month, Hallelujah, Junction, and a beautifully written book. And if you have any interest in contemporary music and, of course, in John Adams, I do recommend it very highly, and a beautiful compliment to you and your wonderful performances in Chicago, and to Gerald Finley, who will be singing the role of Oppenheimer with us in our performances. I just wanted to say also, as an audience member, seeing it in Chicago and watching the DVD now, you talked about how sometimes Adams is accused of manipulating his audiences or propagandizing, and I felt just the opposite in seeing Dr. Atomic. I felt it was very much like On the Transmigration of Souls. I felt that Sellers and Adams gave the audience the space to experience what was being discussed, but to give you plenty of room to reach your own conclusions and have your own emotions. I felt it was, as you said, there was a real-time sense of it moving along, but I never felt manipulated, really. I felt that it was being presented to you and being presented in a very eloquent way, but for me at least, not a manipulative way.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I know they both believe in that, and I do too, that art is the ultimate democracy. Everyone gets their own experience, and it shouldn't be any other way. I'm sometimes asked, well, what do you want your audience to experience when this happens? I don't want the audience. Everyone will have, there will be as many experiences as there are individuals in the audience, which is as it should be. I believe it was a San Francisco-Amsterdam commission.
It was.
Or was Lyric? No, Lyric was part of it too.
Well, actually, it was from an idea by Pamela Rosenberg in San Francisco. She wanted John Adams to write a modern version of the Faust legend. And he finally turned to Oppenheimer, because Oppenheimer, first, he was, of course, famous for being the leader of this experiment, this huge experiment, and then later had his own problems with being accused of being a communist sympathizer, and had his own epiphany later in terms of how he felt about what they had invented. So Adams felt this was a perfect way to explore the Faust legend, and that was the beginning from San Francisco Opera. I'm not sure if it was a co-commission at that time or whether it was solely San Francisco Opera to begin with, although, of course,
it might have developed later.
Yeah, but that was the very beginning of it.
I know by the time it was done in San Francisco, the Amsterdam and Chicago performances were planned.
Now, we should mention, of course, Donald Runnels conducted
He did the premiere.
The world premiere. So there's even though this is our first production in Atlanta, there has already been a huge history and a very strong connection between Atlanta Symphony conductors and the history of this piece.
And the Atlanta Symphony with John Adams.
Correct.
Who has guest conducted here. And even before I came here as music director, there had been a lot of Adams activity with the orchestra.
We'll take some more questions before we break for the evening.
Handel stole from himself and others. So there was a similar mutability of material. Handel, I think, one of the problems for Bach with singers is that he writes as instrumentally for singers as he does for instruments, and as vocally for instruments as he does for singers. Handel, I think, was much more sensitive to the human voice and to its peculiarities and needs, to breath itself. So I think there's more of Handel's music that is medium specific than Bach, but he certainly is also mutable. It's fantastic. Oh, it's terrific, isn't it? Right. And cymbals.
If you want to explore that orchestration, there is a wonderful recording on RCA with Sir Thomas Beecham conducting, and it uses the Eugene Goossens orchestration, which is quite a bit larger than what Handel probably could have hoped for, at least. He might have liked it, but I don't think he had all of that at his disposal at the time that he wrote it. So it's really quite a technicolor orchestration of the work. Other questions?
The Fantasia version.
Yes.
Back to the discussion about Dr. Time. Because it is so historically inept, I'm curious as to how receptive your audiences were in Chicago when they're one or two generations removed from what we grew up with in a new nuclear age. Did you find an equal reception on their part, or were they too differentiated from what had actually happened to understand what it felt like?
In the anecdotal information I got, just the people I spoke with, there were generational differences in response. And what I found gratifying was the seriousness with which a younger generation, who maybe hasn't talked about this issue as much as my generation did, and certainly my parents' generation did, they were struck by the opera. They were brought into the contemplation of it in a very serious way, without thinking back to earlier experiences of reacting to it. But nonetheless, the seriousness of the subject certainly hit home cross-generationally with different response because of experience.
Has there been any thought of doing it in Japan?
That's a good question. I don't know if there has.
It has been done at the Netherlands Opera.
That's correct.
Well, I would imagine, just given Adam's acceptance throughout the world, that it's inevitable.
I have no doubt that he'll get it performed anywhere he can.
That too. Any other questions? Well, first of all, again, I want to thank all of you for spending your Sunday evening with us and for your ongoing support of this wonderful orchestra. You are really the people who make the great music that comes from this stage possible week in and week out, and we cannot thank you enough. And speaking of not being able to thank people enough, Robert, thank you for another unforgettable evening of music, of teaching.
Thank you, too, Ken.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to see you.